What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. The new uploading schedule will now be at 10 AM Eastern Standard Time, just 4 hours later from the original uploading schedule at 6 AM. Please let me know down below in the comments if it's convenient for you or not. And yeah, let's try it like this. Ukraine just found a way to hit Russia in a place Moscow absolutely does not want people to notice. And it's not just another oil depot, not just another refinery, and not just somewhere deep inside Russian territory where one explosion gets posted online and then disappears from the news cycles forever. No, this time it hit directly inside the logistical bloodstream that connects Russia to occupied Crimea and keeps the southern front line supplied. And that is why this today's story matters so much. Because when fuel rationing begins in Crimea, when the Novorossiya highway becomes dangerous for tanker trucks, and when Russia bans gasoline exports, this is no longer just another drone story. This is a system admitting, even if it refuses to say it out loud, that the rear is no longer safe. For years, the Kremlin tried to sell this war as something happening somewhere else, somewhere on television, somewhere inside dramatic maps and patriotic studio shows, while ordinary Russians were supposed to keep going on vacation, using the internet, and just pretending that an endless war can stay far away from their wallets forever, from their jobs and their just daily routines. But Ukraine has spent the last several years changing the shape of the war. The battlefield is no longer only on the trench lines. It is no longer only the few hundred yards Russia tries to advance every single month. The battlefield is now the supply road, the oil terminal, and the land corridor to Crimea, and also the Russian federal budget that has to pretend that all of this is still somehow manageable. So today, we're talking about Ukraine's new middle-range strike campaign, why the roughly 200 km zone between FPV drones and long-range drones matters so much, how at least 125 trucks were reportedly destroyed along routes feeding Crimea, why fuel coupons in Crimea are a political embarrassment for Putin, why Bloomberg's 16-year low crude processing figure is only part of the story, and why the 2026 election season may arrive at a very uncomfortable moment for the Kremlin. So much to talk about today's video, so let's begin right now. Here's the part that most people miss, because when people talk about drone warfare, they usually imagine two separate things: tiny FPV drones near the front line and larger long-range drones flying hundreds of kilometers into Russia. But the most important area may be the space between them. For a long time, there was a roughly 200-kilometer deep zone behind the Russian front, where some of the most important logistics were sitting in a gray area. Near the line of contact, Ukraine used FPV and reconnaissance drones to create several kilometer deep drone-controlled zones, where Russian vehicles, supply runs, rotations and equipment movements could be watched and hit quickly. Deep inside Russia, Ukraine used larger drones to reach oil infrastructure and strategic facilities. But between these two layers was the gray middle zone, and that zone is exactly where Russia's ground lines of communication live. That means supply routes, ammunition depots, fuel transportation, troop movement roads, and just in general simply networks connecting mainland Russia to occupied territories, including Crimea. Now Ukraine appears to be filling that exact gap. This is not just one spectacular operation like the Kerch bridge truck incident, and not just a rare attack MS strike at 200 or 300 kilometers away. No, this is a campaign repeated and scalable, designed to make Russian logistics expensive, uncertain and exhausting. For the first 3 years of the war, Russia's biggest advantage was not that it was moving quickly on the battlefield. Well, because it was not. The Russian army was advancing at a rate of a few hundred yards a month, sometimes roughly only 1 kilometer a month maximum, and every attempt to push harder created more pressure on the system. The real imbalance was behind the front line, where Russia could strike Ukraine's rear with missiles and drones almost across the entire country, while Ukraine had fewer ways to respond. Well, guess what? That imbalance is now shrinking. Ukraine has scaled drone production, improved targeting and turned rear area pressure into something routine instead of exceptional. Russia no longer has a clean rear. Sounds weird, but you get the idea. Crimea no longer has a normal land corridor, and the Novorossiya highway is no longer just a road on the map. It is now a strategic vulnerability. And once a road becomes a vulnerability, the next question is extremely obvious. What happens to the territory that depends on that exact road? Before we answer this question, guys, please check the links down below. There you can find ways to support our work here on YouTube if you wish to do so. For example, our own Patreon page, where these episodes are released in early access and have an additional chapter in the end. There are also one-time donations if you want to do so through PayPal. And we even have our own merch store, therussiandude.com, where you can buy t-shirts, hats, shorts, pants, and hoodies, such as this one. Iconic The Russian Dude yellow hoodie. All the links are once again down below. Thanks so much. Now let's continue. Now here's where things get really interesting, because Crimea is not just another occupied region for Putin. It is the symbolic trophy of the last 12 years, the centerpiece of the imperial mythology, the place Moscow presented as permanent, protected and untouchable. And now this very same territory is dealing with fuel rationing coupons. Just think about how embarrassing that is politically. Russia spent years telling people Crimea was forever, and now ordinary residents are being told that fuel may be no longer something you can just simply buy like normal people in normal regions. Instead, access may depend on coupons, availability tools, emergency rules, and whatever temporary system local authorities can assemble while pretending that this is not a major failure and a region-wide emergency. The reason for all this is extremely simple. Ukraine is attacking the land corridor to Crimea, especially the Novorossiya highway, which connects mainland Russia with the occupied southern regions and, once again, Crimea. At least 125 reportedly trucks have already been destroyed in this campaign, and that changes how everyone looks at the road. I mean, think about it. Would you drive a tanker truck down that highway if you believe it might be watched by Ukrainian drones or affected by drone-mounted mines? Would you send valuable cargo through a route repeatedly associated with these tracks? Well, of course not. That is how Crimea starts becoming an island again, and not because every bridge is gone and not because every road is permanently blocked, but simply because risk, delay, cost and uncertainty keep rising. A territory can be technically connected and still be economically squeezed. A road can exist on paper and still fail as a reliable supply artery. That is why fuel rationing matters. It's not just about gasoline. Fuel keeps tourism alive, businesses moving, military logistics operating and public confidence from collapsing. When fuel becomes uncertain, people notice immediately. And Crimea has another problem. Its travel industry is one of the few major economic contributors it has, and even that industry does not make the region self-sufficient. Tourism helps reduce the burden on the federal budget, yes, but what kind of holiday season are you supposed to have when people are reading about strikes, fuel shortages and dangerous road corridors? The Atan gas station chain, for example, the largest chain on the peninsula, reportedly rolled out an online tool showing that fuel was not readily available on pumps. That may sound like a technical detail, but politically it is brutal, because the government can call it a temporary shortage or a logistical adjustment, but ordinary people understand exactly what it really means. The system is no longer smooth, to say the least, to be politically correct. And once the system is no longer smooth in Crimea, Putin's most symbolic trophy becomes a budget problem, a propaganda problem, and a public confidence problem all at once. But Crimea is only the most visible part of this whole entire story, because the same pressure is now reaching Russia's oil and fuel system more broadly. But that's only half the story, because the road to Crimea is not the only place where Ukraine is applying pressure. Russia's oil and fuel system is starting to look like a network that can be disrupted faster than Moscow can repair, defend, or financially absorb. For a very long time, oil depot strikes were treated as just major news. Now they happen so often that smaller incidents barely even register unless a large refinery, major oil terminal, or strategically important facilities involved. That just tells you how much the baseline has shifted. When burning oil depots stop being shocking, Russia's economic rear has become part of the normal rhythm of the war. Bloomberg reported that Russia's crude processed rate sank to a 16-year low, but the more revealing detail is Moscow's response. Russia banned jet fuel exports after already placing a full ban on gasoline exports and a partial ban on diesel exports. Governments do not usually restrict major petroleum product exports simply because everything is going wonderfully. They do it when the domestic system is under pressure. And that matters because petroleum products are not just the trade items on the spreadsheet. They are taxed revenue, military supply, and domestic price stability. Russia and oil has always been inseparable. If Ukrainian strikes help push Russia into export restrictions because domestic shortages are becoming a huge problem, then Ukraine is not just creating military inconvenience, it is pushing on the financial structure behind the war itself. This is where the cost-benefit ratio becomes painful for Moscow. A drone costing thousands or maybe even tens of thousands of dollars can disrupt an industrial facility generating millions in daily revenue. A wave of relatively inexpensive drones can force Russia to spend far more on defense, emergency logistics, and political damage control. The shield eventually becomes more expensive than the sword. Manufacturing new air defense systems is slow and costly. Buying them from someone else is not easy because every country wants to strengthen its own stockpiles first. They only sell the excesses. Moving existing air defense systems also creates trade-offs, because every system protecting one refinery is a system not protecting another facility, city, or symbolic target. Unless it's Putin's dacha, and well, you can have 10 of them. Meanwhile, drone production based on civilian use components can scale faster, which is a nightmare for a huge centralized state trying to defend thousands of valuable targets across enormous territory. Russia is quite large, but that size becomes a weakness because when the attacker can choose targets while the defender has to protect everything. This is also why the missile threat alert across the entire Ural Federal District includes Western Siberia. It also matters. Even if Ukraine cannot or does not need to hit East Siberia or Russia's easternmost provinces, the psychological and administrative effect of expanding strike range is already significant. Strategic assets across a much wider area now have to be treated as exposed. And here is the uncomfortable part for Moscow. These disruptions are not predictable like ordinary budget problems. Debt, tax revenues, inflation, corporate strain can be modeled, blamed, predicted, or just hidden behind statistics. But the refinery disruption, fuel export ban, or logistics breakdown in Crimea is much harder to place neatly into federal budget plan. You can budget for war when the war stays where you exactly want it and expect it to stay. But when fuel shortages, transport disruptions, and rising prices start overlapping, people begin to realize that the cost of war is no longer hidden inside military reports. And that brings us to the political problem. Now please keep this in mind because it is very important. The Kremlin's domestic strategy depends on the illusion that the war is historic, necessary, and somehow not supposed to interfere too much with daily life. That fantasy works until the war starts appearing at the fuel pump and the grocery bill and the phone screen, when internet just suddenly stops working, keeps loading, and nothing happens. For years, Russian propaganda could present the war as a television saga full of maps, arrows, and conflict language, while the real costs were pushed into contract soldiers, poor regions, and families without enough influence to force a national television and conversation. That worked as long as the effects were concentrated, but now the effects are spreading. Once again, internet outages, we spoke about them many times already, fuel shortages, and the government's attempt to take money from citizens. Each individual problem can be explained away, like, for example, fuel shortages, all this is temporary, internet outage, security measure, security concerns, higher prices, external pressure, it's the West doing this. But when all of this happens together, the explanation starts sounding less like confidence and more like panic dressed in the official language. Russia's security system makes this even worse, because whenever there is a drone threat, the state often responds with wider disruptions. An oil depot may be affected in one part of a city, but the internet blackout can hit an entire region. This is the hidden multiplier effect of Ukraine's campaign. The strike itself may affect a facility, depot, or road, but the Russian state response spreads the consequences to ordinary people. This is how bans, rationing systems, and public silence all become part of the same story. Ukraine applies pressure on infrastructure, and the Russian government applies that exact pressure through its own control reflex. That creates a serious problem for the Kremlin's narrative of endurance. Russian officials and pro-war voices love comparing the current situation to Peter the Great, Second World War, and just long historical wars, as if a 20-year war is national management plan. But that argument sounds better in a television studio than it does to someone dealing with fuel rationing, unstable internet and shrinking normal life. Even some pro-war figures understand the military problem. General Gurlev, for example, is not seriously expecting a clean military ending in the next couple of years. That extremely matters because if even hardened pro-war voices do not have a convincing victory timeline, the government is just left selling a war that is costly now and certain later, and increasingly visible inside Russia itself. This is where the 1 kilometer per month battlefield logic becomes politically absurd. What is the point of celebrating another patch of woodland if the prices burning oil depot, disrupted highway to Crimea, and the population slowly realizing that the rear is not, well, really rear anymore? That does not mean Russia suddenly falls apart. Large systems usually do not work like that, unfortunately. But it does mean that the stability story becomes thinner every month. And that matters because Russia is slowly moving towards a politically sensitive period in 2026. And this is where the timing becomes very uncomfortable for Putin personally. Here is the real reason all this matters. Because the current drone campaign is not happening in a political vacuum. It is unfolding ahead of Russia's general election campaign in the fall of 2026. And while Russian elections are not free in the normal democratic sense, they still matter to the Kremlin because they are used to as a staged proof of stability, control and national unity. That is why timing matters. Only a month ago the Novorossiya highway was not considered the issue it is now, and now it is being disrupted by drone-mounted mines and repeated strikes. A month ago there was no missile threat watch across the Ural Federal District. A month ago there was no clear sign of Russia banning jet fuel exports after strike-related damage contributed to domestic pressure. This campaign is evolving not over years, but over weeks at this point. Now imagine what this means by the time the election season intensifies. Ukraine knows Putin will be facing a stressful political period. Ukraine knows the Kremlin wants to present stability, not rationing, strength, not vulnerable supply corridors, and inevitability, not a system reacting to cheap drones with expensive consequences. This creates a strategic opportunity. Ukraine does not need to match Russia missile for missile or tank to tank. Ukraine can target the connective tissue of the war machine itself, which are logistics corridors, fuel systems, and symbolic regions, like once again Crimea. The goal is not one dramatic event or breakthrough. The goal is constant management pressure, where every week brings another disruption, restriction, and another reminder that the war is moving inward. And the Russian government's response does not solve the underlying problem. It mostly shifts the burden to citizens through bans, restrictions, and emergency controls once again. That may help the authorities, yes, to manage immediate risk, but it also makes ordinary life less normal. That is not a great campaign message. This is why Ukraine's middle-range strike campaign may become one of the most important developments of the year. It is cheap, scalable, and strategically annoying in exactly the way Russia hates it the most. It does not just damage hardware. It erodes the idea that Moscow can control escalation, keep Crimea supplied, and preserve domestic calm, all this at once. Russia's geography, normally presented as a source of strength, becomes a defensive nightmare. Huge territory means huge exposure. Huge infrastructure means huge maintenance and protection requirements. And huge symbolism around Crimea means huge embarrassment when, sometimes, something as basic as fuel availability becomes uncertain. The Kremlin can pretend everything is planned, but the pattern is getting harder to hide. Ukraine identifies a vulnerable layer, scales a tool that works, creates repeated pressure, and eventually forces Russia to spend more money, impose more controls, and explain more failures to its people. So the question is not whether Ukraine will continue this kind of campaign. The question is how much more precise, frequent, and politically damaging it becomes 6 months from now, 1 year from now, or 2 years from now, who knows, if the war continues and Putin remains stuck inside the same strategy that created this vulnerability in the first place. Guys, please make sure to subscribe to our channel, like this video, because in the next episodes we will keep breaking down these hidden pressure points, the strategic shifts most people overlook, and the stories that show where this war is really heading before the official speeches catch up. Don't forget about the Patreon, link is down below. See you on Wednesday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in